Everyone to law by UKM IV on the motion to privatize the police in the US and I read references and the
Mr. Speaker, I'm very excited to debate this motion given how incredibly innovative and new this particular thing is, and seeing how most countries, if none of them, ever privatize police institutions and basic rights. So I'm going to start with the limitations of the motion and why it's wrong. But perhaps just a few things that we think are reasonable to assume in this particular debate and what will formulate our policy as a consequence. The first and most important thing is to understand that police as a concept or institution cannot be fully and conceptually in the same way as we generally conceive privatization, in the same way as we privatize everything else, which means the normal context privatization means the shareholdings of an entire company or corporation institution is shared between a group of individuals who must not be of a public nature, of a state-based nature. We think that's impossible to happen within the police system because one, there's no way to fractionalize the assets within the police institution. But more than that, also, there's no way in which you're able to contractually make people liable for the payments of the service for the police, in which case, even if there could be incredibly erratic to the extent that it wouldn't be a fair transaction anyways. The point being that there's no way in which you can properly fund these policemen with a system of general privatization that we use with other corporations and entities in society today. What this has meant consequently is that, of course, it's opening up, but because we are forced with this motion, we will try our best to make this particular policy as private as possible. But at the end of the day, the main contractors and the main people paying out the monies will be the state, but nothing else, and no involvement of the state in any other ways, means, and forms. So the only part that the state never pays is to pay them, basically. All right? Policy-wise, what we're going to do is, first of all, primarily institution, the current methods of policing within district level and county level institutions in the US that's used in many federated states currently, and macrofy it, make it bigger. So to the extent that all counties are able to elect their own sheriffs and control over the particular districts and counties that they exist in, and determine policing policies and exceptions to particular types of laws on a state-based level that can be exceptions to these particular counties and individuals, we're happy to enforce this to a more macrosphere to the entire country, but to be as specific within the individual counties as need be. The divisions, of course, will be drawn up by some arbitrary board to make decisions in the most fair way possible, but the key distinction here is that these individual zones or distinction of institution of places will be able to hire and contract through their representatives, the individual types of private enforcement entities to regulate these entire things. This means two things. First, it means that the attorney generals or the pseudo attorney generals or the proxy attorney generals who prosecute individual criminals in these particular cases will be selected by these representatives and these counties as a whole, and will be given the contracts to determine who they want to prosecute and not. But second, perhaps more importantly, the enforcers themselves, which means the policemen on the ground, will be also contracted by private entities as a whole. What will happen, and there's no shortage of these private entities that exist out there to provide these kinds of either military or policing particular or law enforcement services out there, we will contractually bind them to particular sets of terms that will be determined at these particular representation councils or meetings, whether it be town council meetings or state level interaction meetings or whatnot. These particular conditions will be set out by these particular instances and be held contractually liable to these particular private actors and private companies, to the extent wherever they renege on this particular or don't, say for instance, breach a liability of like constitutional protection, would vendor their contract individual, and then they will lose their job. Anyway, the end of this very long policy is to discuss what the real problems are that we want to solve in this particular debate. There are three that we're particularly concerned about. First, is that a big part of the problem of the United States policing system is that it's based upon a system that's incredibly tied up with the political system of the American Congress, American Parliament, I guess. Right, to the extent that every single attorney general is elected in by a particular government of the day, is chosen by these particular actors, there's a great incentive that encourages these attorney generals to run in their pre-election campaigns, run for particular types of popular policies, and penetrate towards ethnicities or groups that are in the majority and traditionally tend to be dominant within elections as well. And second, after they get elected to these positions, pursue policies that are, one, fundamentally in line with the government's and fundamentally in line with the kind of state priorities, prerogatives that are consistent with state policies at that point in time. I'll go into detail with this in just a moment. But second of all, to also therefore, again, like I said, or underrepresent particular institutions or groups of voters who therefore traditionally don't vote in the majority or have a significant say within the political discourse. The second problem is that because of this particular the political institution, the result of this is the underfunding of the Attorney General's office in particular areas, a lack of prosecution in many areas, but more so than that, this is based upon a building of legacy of these Attorney Generals subscribed this moment as well. Third and last of all is that there's general lack of accountability because of the kinds of protection that are offered by statute and by state-based laws that protect state officials, which we think should be removed as far as law. Yes?
Well, the privatization is the priority of a private police force and a public police force, will it be the same?
No, obviously not. The public police force is determined by currently the Attorney General and anything that he thinks is important by their day and age, which is systematic to what I just described, and 3 problems of why distinctly the US system is tied to the fact that Attorney Generals create the law and determine how individual law enforcement officers would make a change. The difference here is that they're contractually bounded and contractually determined, or the scope of actions that the policemen can do are contractually determined by these individual counties and town councils, as opposed to a general discretion by the Attorney General currently in the system. So first, why do we think this is good? The first and most important thing is we think that individuals should have a greater say and a greater mandate and ability to determine for themselves the security systems to which they have availability to. And to that extent, we think the current system that arbitrarily requires every single person to wherever you live to systematically subscribe to the generic system of policing that is in place for state-based white systems is wrong. But more than that, we think the specificity to which particular types of policies, such as the number of troopers or the demographic or the racial composition of troops, or sorry, troopers on the ground, or in patrols, for instance, are things that the individual should determine as well. Insofar as perhaps having white officers or majority white officers encourages more police brutality and dominated black neighborhoods is bad, we think having the ability to contractually enable or to contractually force these private entities to be more specific with the kinds of demographics or requirements of your individual cultures are things that first of all is in line with your constitutional right to have security to yourself, but second of all benefits the societies considerably more. But second, we think also a big part of this is accountability. There are 2 problems with this. The first is a state-based white protections that cover state officials as a whole, which makes them unprosecutable and reduces the liability, is a huge problem that we saw even in Ferguson, where individual officials can't get prosecuted or can't get prosecuted properly because they're protected by the kinds of institutions and laws that protect other state officials as well. When it comes to law enforcement and the security of other individuals, we fundamentally don't think that state officials or officials who promote security should have these exceptions in any circumstance. But more than that, we also think the Attorney General shouldn't have the ability to be beholden to the governments at the time. The recent settlement that Eric Holder passed with JP Morgan Chase denied JP Morgan Chase of any kinds of liability over the data during the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. We think these systems were created, or this decision to settle was created because we had to had to toe the line of the state to maintain the kinds of economic stability that the US is currently residing in, because of the kinds of institutions or the kinds of direction politics wants to bring in of itself. We disagree that this is the right thing. To the extent that huge corporations right now are being protected by the state, they should not be protected by institutions of security that are meant to unravel these institutions while currently promoting horrible misdeeds to society as a whole. For these reasons, for the betterment of the US, happy conclusions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, I only live in this world for only 15 years, but I don't know what is the problem with the police style. That's why I don't know anything about the motion, right? I also never went to US before, so I also cannot understand Singaporean accent. Even that, we think this debate need to follow opening opposition, Mr. Speaker. Before that, few point of rebuttals of his accent, right? Number one, these people try to want to tell us about how they want to actually, when they have the greater mandate, the problem is status quo, because now all geographical demographic actually subscribing to generic rules on itself, right? But we think number one, the problem solution is mismatched in the first place. If you want to solve the problem of how the alteration of regulation in the first place, how you want to follow the geographical demographic that your side want to talk about, therefore it can also happen under government runs. We don't see why there's something that needs to be exclusively on your side, but it's under the private institution that your side wanted to talk about, right? Because they want to talk about how certain there are certain demographic, like black people or whatsoever. But I think those kind of alteration of policy can also happen under governments as the government advice, not only exclusive on their side, right? They only actually address the problem, but never tell us why their policy is going to solve that problem in the end of the day, right? Because that's why we think the key of the debate today not about who is the most Singaporean. But before that, But secondly, the people try to tell us about how prosecution of state officials is something that is not viable in status quo, right? We don't think so. Number one, there are already natural check and balances to begin with, right? We don't see that. We see that even in US, that I never went, we see that the state officials get prosecuted if they done something wrong in the end of the day. But even if, right, we think that it's a mutual harm under both sides, right? You cannot simply just assume that private corporation, private institution also does have favorism on kind of state officials in the end of the day. Given that, there's something that assumption from their side by telling us that the private corporate by privatizing will make them clean as not tied by any form of state officials whatsoever, right? Because they still have their own political interest. For example, like I prefer this politician, so why should I prosecute him or her? Given that, we think that it's a form of mutual harm on both sides, not on your side, right? But it's on our side. We have check and balances to begin with, but on your side we have no check and balances because it's private, right? You can simply do anything what you want. The state just only funding it, but the problem the state just only funding it, but you can actually self-regulatory in its stuff. We don't think self-regulatory is good enough when it comes to certain things like police and then officer. Before I move on, yes, Patrick.
Check and balances can happen when a private police force doesn't comply with safety requirements. They get terminated by the contract by the state, and isn't that a check and balance?
Yeah, if you terminate their contract, then who will become the police? Within the end of the day, you need to tell us why the problem is something that only can be exclusively solved under your side by privatizing this kind of police force, right? We see that the problem by their side is they simply assume that by privatizing, then all these problems are being gone. Without realizing that there are no check and balances to begin with, right? The check and balances they are talking about is not something that is effective when it comes to privatization. That my speaker will tell you later. No. Now let's look what is the main contention from opening opposition, right? We tell you how our side provide better serving of obligation in the police force in stuff. Number one, the first level, how the idea of accountability, right? We need to understand that when private entities are not accountable for society, right? So it means that they have no obligation in order to protect society or whatsoever. Because why? Because you need to understand that they didn't want to skip the motion. So let's just follow the idea of privatization in itself, right? The only difference is the funding. Then we need to understand when private entities are not accountable for society, then we think that what is the bad for two things. Number one, the idea of protecting society or serving is based on goodwill or whether I want to do it or I don't want to do it in the first place. That's why we tell you something is harmful. Because why? Because we need a compulsion, a legal obligation that makes you compelled to protect and do your job. That's why we need to understand this can only happen under our paradigm, right? When the state runs and the state have the capacity to regulate those kind of idea. Because your side, simply when you privatize this kind of police force, there become nothing check and and balances of how do you regulate this kind of idea go.
So your current check and balances enable policemen to get away with crimes they have because they rendered the state officials and rendered immune from prosecution. Why is this right?
Number one, we think that the fact that immune by prosecution can also happen under their side, right? Because now this private police force can also choose whether who I want to prosecute or who I don't want to prosecute, right? Given that, that's why we need to be realistic and see which side does solve the problem, right? At least on our side, when the government can actually regulate this kind of idea, but your side, no, they cannot regulate, right? Just assume that these people are actually just morally good and they are against corruption or whatsoever. In the end of the day, they will actually follow the idea of justice. But second idea, we need to understand that national security is the government duty, and the government cannot run away from this form of duty, right? We need to understand when it comes to national security, we need to government have full duty in order to make sure this thing does happen. But what happens when you private thing or when you private this kind of police force? Few things. Number one, when there is a failure or there is a dispute in this kind of police forces, you will blame this private entity to begin with, right? Therefore, the government can escape from their obligation from giving a national security the idea in itself, right? Because now the government are not accountable, and this kind of private entities that are not regulated is something that is accountable in the first place. We think that is bad in itself. But second level, you need to understand is as if now the government is also complicit in harming society, right? When the government also running away from their obligation to protect society, now the government is also complicit by putting society in certain harm that might happen in the end of the day. But lastly, why privatization is bad, right? Because it creates no urgency for the government to serve the best, and it creates no urgency for the police force to serve their best, right? You need to understand the reason why the government actually running, the reason why government runs are good, because now the fact that they have natural check and balances about how society can vote them out, how can the society can kick them out if they don't do well, right? But the fact now it cannot happen under their side. There is no urgency for this police force to serve their best or to do their obligation, because the fact that they are not legally or by the only reason for we to make these individuals accountable for society and keep doing their job is by making it under the state and not making it under private entity where there are no regulations, and you cannot simply just tell us there are regulations but no right because they are right. So summarizing my speech, what I told today, right? Number one, you need to understand this debate is not about just talking about problems in US, but talking about which side does solve the problem in the end of the day, right? They simply just tell you about the problem, but never tell you the how do you solve the problem. Therefore, go inside opening opposition.
Try to get what? Yeah, okay. Very cool, right? Idiot. Right. They can't debate this in a vacuum. This motion specifically calls for us to privatize the police, specifically in the USA. What they've never done was tell us the problems that exist in the United States of America and how their police system is essentially politicized and gridlocked in a way that consequently just allows majority races and people who are already privileged to continue their privilege even in the area of law enforcement. That is a problem that we were trying to solve on our side and they never quite understood. So let's talk about this debate on two levels. One, how do we have a better police force, that ensure the protection of more people in the United States? And secondly, this idea of government responsibility and how governments are somehow shirking their responsibility by privatizing the police force. Actually, you know what? Let's talk about the second thing first. So what exactly the opening said to us? They basically said to us, they gave us really contextualist vacuum full analysis of how governments are shredding their responsibilities when it comes to privatization of public goods, like the kind of arguments that we see in all privatization of public goods, like things, right? But here's the thing. When it comes to the fact that we recognize that the police force would be better off under a privatized system, we think that it's perfectly reasonable for government to abrogate this responsibility to other individuals in order to ensure the more efficient running and the better protection of its own citizens. But secondly, more importantly, we think that the fact that government is still paying these people and are in charge of creating guidelines for these individuals, no thank you sir, and also who they want to give these tenders to and ensuring that these people are held to account when they are contractually liable for the things that they do, shows that the government is still taking responsibility for the safety of its people. So we don't really see why this is actually a problem. Yes? Oh, okay, sure. No, it's fine. Okay. Now, so let's move on to the second more important question of today's debate, right? How exactly do we have a better police force? And here's where they just conveniently ignore everything that Brian said. Other guys or Brian having a Singaporean accent. That's not true, by the way. So what is the biggest problem? What are the few problems that happen in the police force? The first problem that they never quite dealt with was the idea of politicization, right? And we bring to you the example of how Eric Holder was elected Attorney General in the United States by President Obama himself. This clearly points to a very clear problem that exists in status quo, right? When these police chiefs are essentially linked closely to the politics that happen in the country itself. Why is this problematic? Because this means that politics has always been influenced by populism and things that affect the votes, right? This means that things like, for example, where your police force is deployed to, which state gets better policing, which state gets more funding and better equipment, for instance, are all closely linked to who exactly is voting for you or who you want to have voting for you, because you have an added incentive to ensure that these places are safer, or like these individuals think that the government is doing a good job. This means that like certain areas where, like for example, there are majority black races who are less likely to be part of the voter turnout in big elections, don't get the kind of protections that you're talking about, essentially because of the politicized nature of these places. But secondly, what's even worse is that we think that they never quite understood the analysis that came out from Brian, where he told you that the pernicious harm in this case, the pernicious harm, like that's not an excuse to not rebut, right? But anyway, like the pernicious harm that comes about is that the attorney generals as well are also linked to the police system. This means that the very people who are choosing whether or not to prosecute individuals are essentially being like closely linked to the politicization of this entire issue itself. That means that the kind of criminals that are being prosecuted and the kind of crimes that you see like unnecessary for the safety of your people are essentially being chosen by people who's like has like no inclination whatsoever to ensure the welfare of like the people in general, and every single incentive to only look out for themselves to ensure that they are re-elected or elected into the post of attorney general. We think it's a pernicious incentive on their side, and they've never quite dealt with this issue on our end. Right, so we thought that we told you that the very clear reasoning or the very clear way that we walk out of this is by privatizing these institutions. You essentially like contract it out to a very much like a very much impartial and objective third party, right, who has absolutely no incentive whatsoever to be part of this political business, because there are other ways in which you can ensure that the companies that you contract these to are fair and just and contractually liable. And also because these pernicious problems, now taking a moment, these pernicious problems of politicization generally only surface themselves when there is no actual contract and like people can do things on the slide. But before I move on, yes. No. Yes? Yes?
Okay. You can't say that the company that you're going to contract this thing is impartial without actually telling us what is your state of impartial anyway.
So like impartial is very easy, right? It's the idea that it's the laws that we're talking about right now. The reason why these laws are not being like prosecuted properly is because these individuals have the autonomy to be able to decide like as and when what they want to prosecute for the most arbitrary of reasons in order to gain some sort of political mileage. By the point at which you contract it out to a company that don't have these particular incentives, then these arbitrary reasons and these perniciousness doesn't exist any longer. What was the second problem that we told you? The second problem that we told you, which is what was devastating and really, really shocked me and made me very aggrieved when I read about it, was the lack of accountability in current police forces, right? Like, we just take a look at what happened in Ferguson. The guy who like clearly shot a black man with absolutely no reason whatsoever wasn't indicted for the crime that he committed. And the reason for this is simple, right? These individuals like, it's very, very difficult for people to like hold these individuals to account, because these individuals are protected by the very same laws that we use to protect our state actors. The fact that these policemen are seen to be actors of the state, no, thank you, madam, essentially gives them the very cover that we use to protect our own people. This means it's incredibly difficult for us to indict them of anything, because like they are being protected under laws. But more importantly, and here's where my positive material from Deputy Prime Minister come in, is that whenever we indict these individuals, given that the process is so delinked and there's absolutely no like, no thank you madam, there's absolutely no like separation of power, is that what happens is that whenever you indict an individual, it seems to be an indictment of government policies as well. So what happens now is that the government, by indicting a white policeman who shot a black officer, is unable to hide under the guise of the fact that like you're simply, unable to hide under the guise of the fact that this is simply something that was necessary for self-defense. Rather, it becomes an indictment of them being racist and then made the mistake of not changing the police forces quickly enough, of being racist, of privileging a certain majority race, and not ensuring that these problems are being solved. Why didn't we solve this problem with privatization? Analysis again that came up from Brian and they never once dealt with. It's the idea that look, when you have objectives, like an objective company that whose only priority is the efficiency of ensuring like safety in your street, what happens is that they are now much more incentivized to ensure that these changes are made rapidly, right? That if, for example, the demographics of your country changes, like what happened in Ferguson over like a decade, and like the number of blacks in your county moved up from 30 to like something like 70%, then they have more incentive also to hire more black contractors to like better enable like the carrying out of police business on the street. And this is specifically important for these places, because this is what we need, this kind of rapid movement that we need to ensure safety and like better carrying out of these duties as well. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we propose.
So, Mr. Speaker, we're very glad to tell you that finally right now we understand Brian's speech, and that's where we're going to deal with it. Okay, so firstly, let's differentiate between the government and the opposition. Okay, basically what the government told us today is that there are certain problems that happen within the US police force, right? And they believe that privatization is the best way to deal with it without telling us how and why is it better. Okay, on the government side, on the opposition side, what we're going to tell you is that, right, any kind of harm that they try to bring up is already self-regulatory in nature because the police force is state-owned and whatnot. So let's look at several problems that they brought up into this debate, right? Okay, so firstly, they told us that it's very hard for them to prosecute government officials because right now they're directly linked to certain government officials, right? So that might grant them immunity. Okay, we tell you that under this certain sense, right, that kind of thing can also exist under your paradigm, where there is a form of privatization. Why? Because the main reason being that the police force is already funded by the government, which means that they're also affiliated to the government in a certain way. And in order for them to keep getting funded, Mr. Speaker, they need to look favorable towards the government and whatnot, right? And we believe that this is even more harmful because the natural check and balance that happens, no thank you, doesn't necessarily exist under their paradigm. Natural check and balance here is the fact that people actually have some form of influence over the government, but the people doesn't have any kind of influence under private entities, right? Because the government needs to be able to satisfy these individuals within the community, and that's why, right? So that's why, right? Like for example, even if they wish to grant immunity and whatnot, right? These people might not agree with it, and these people will go to the government, and the government might be able to listen to them because the government can be influenced by the society based on the power that they give, right? Okay, so secondly, right, Mr. Speaker, they try to tell us that the government also still has some form of responsibility when we try to tell them that they're shirking their responsibility. They gave us examples like, they're funding them and whatnot. Okay, here's the misunderstanding, right? When we tell you that they're shirking their responsibility, it means that when something goes wrong within the police force, they can immediately blame the private entity instead of taking the problem into account themselves, right? That's the problem here. Because right now, if the police force goes wrong and it's owned by a private entity, the government can simply negate it and say, look, it's the fault of a private entity. We have nothing to do with this. We think that sharing this kind of accountability is not really healthy for the government, right? And it's something that we need to deal with, right? Okay, the third problem they try to tell us is the fact that the police, they might choose who to prosecute due to who they want to prosecute due to political margin or some kind of political advantage, right? They give the example of Mike Brown, who got shot 6 times, a few times, right? Because he was black and whatnot, and never got vindicated based on that. Okay. Here's the thing, right? The cop actually went to the court, and the reason why he wasn't punished is because there were 9 white judges, and this was Darren Wilson, who's white. Okay, never mind. I'm not implying anything, but the main idea is that there's a panel, and he's already been put into a fair trial, and the panel decided that he wasn't guilty. So that's why he wasn't prosecuted. It has nothing to do with political advantage or anything like that. No, thank you. But the fourth thing that they tried to tell us is the fact that these companies, they have an objective in order to provide proper security force. Okay, we tell you that this is very baseless under their side, because we agree that right, even in the current status quo, like what they told you, that no private entity would like to take over the police force because it's simply unprofitable to begin with, right? But we're not going to debate on that. But the thing is, right, Mr. Speaker, they fail to tell us why these private companies, they actually have some form of incentive to be accountable towards the society. Because right now, right, Mr. Speaker, these private entities, they don't have any kind of interest in protecting the society. So why would they, right? This is something that they never really explain under their side. Before we move on to my,
So why can the Attorney General of the United States, who isn't elected by the people, tell or settle for a large organization to basically pay out their way of siphoning billions of dollars of people who are innocent and investing in them in the first place?
Okay, never mind. I'll pretend I understood that, right? Okay, so basically he asked us why isn't the Attorney General elected by the people? Okay, we believe that, right? We believe that just because it's privatized doesn't mean that the people necessarily have to say under this also, right? Because these private entities, they're not necessarily meant to be democratic to begin with. So if they choose their own Attorney General, then it also happens under their side, right? We don't think that that's a very valid point to bring up here. So what am I going to tell you is that we're going to tell you that government control police force is better. Why? Because the government basically has some form of supervision and control, right? Okay, so when the government the reason why the government when the government owns this kind of police force, right, then the government has a direct interest to be active in certain regulations within the police force, right? So because they're the one managing it, then of course they have of course they're going to be very, very active in terms of improvements that can happen within the within the police force and whatnot, and also the regulations towards any kind of corruption that happens and stuff like that, right? And the government needs to manage it. Okay, but the difference is when someone else manages it, right, someone from a private entity, then the government has less of an incentive to provide any kind of supervision and whatnot, right? Because why? Because they believe that other people are already doing this for them, so there might be less of a necessity for them to do it themselves. I believe that we won't be able to trust these private institutions that much, also because we're also unsure of what their objectives are when they try to initiate this kind of police force, right? That's what we try to tell you. The difference between government-owned and privately-owned police force is the fact that right now we know that the government would actually be accountable for the society because the government needs to get elected. However, privately owned police force is even more dangerous. Why? Because they don't have any kind of accountability towards society, and they're directly funded by the government, means that they're affiliated to the government in some way, right? Okay, and we believe that the government's disincentive to supervise this is further limited when it's privatized because there exist government's limitations, right? Like what they told you, the government can't directly intervene, can't do anything other than funding. That's how they describe it. And I believe that this is even more dangerous because then the government can provide the proper regulations under the case that something happens, right? Okay, so basically, right, we think that the government will also deploy forces towards to every kind of state or whatnot, regardless whether they're pro-government or not, because they still need to gather the votes from these people, even if these people hate the government so much, right? Okay, so basically, summarizing our case, we tell you that government-owned is better than private-owned. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I went to the United States before. While I might not have direct contact with the police force, or maybe I do, it's still necessary there are certain misaccuracies that you must be addressed today. Let's look at the things that I've talked to you today. First, I'll talk with you about three things. Firstly, accountability of the police force, why it's better if it's privatized. Secondly, how you restore racial confidence in society to allow privatization. And thirdly, tackling important issues such as over-militarization, how private companies are the ones who are able to subdue that kind of trend. But all the rebuttals will be integrated in my presentation. Let's look at the first thing, accountability to the police force. Opening government want to link the idea that Attorney General is elected, therefore you have some political influence within the system itself. Never mind the fact that most Attorney Generals are state-related, but not federal-related, but never mind. The real reason why there's some form of pseudo-immunity towards the police force today is the fact where any suspected wrongdoing is not investigated or prosecuted. It's the fact that when a policeman is convicted or guilty, it is a tacit admission that the state has failed. That the state has not trained the policeman well, that the state has necessarily not fulfilled its obligation to protecting the state. The state doesn't want that kind of image because it's bad public image. They won't get elected, they'll be screwed up in Congress. Given that the state is the one who controls the prosecution or any internal police investigation, it has subversive amount of powers to control or to subdue any kind of honest investigation into the things that happen. That even Michael Brown is not even indicted. Indicted is not even the process of prosecution. It's a referral to being prosecuted. So such small things are not even done. Nick Taylor, when he was shot down by white cops in the New York Police Department, was brushed off as an incident that was not investigated totally. That is the kind of connotation that you had because the state wants to protect its image. Our policy, if you privatize it, the police force will be seen as a neutral party that is not attached to the state. So whenever a wrongdoing occurs, the state has plausible deniability and can allow this kind of private companies to be accountable necessarily. Yes, you are still contracted by the state, but necessarily you are more willing to charge that person or to investigate honestly and openly because you're not directly connected to the state. While the state might give you a contract, that doesn't mean you are directly connected. Therefore, they don't feel the need to protect you like a brother, for example. Then you can say, essentially, the attempt to investigate will be more honest and open on the other side. What opening opposition talk about this debate? Firstly, they said that, well, it's not the fault of the private entity. And anyway, you give the reason for the state to not blame themselves. But essentially, if private companies are the ones who are misdoing it, what is the state going to admit anyway? And he has never explained what is the public utility if the state admits that it's wrong in what thing. I have no idea. Racism, investigations to cover ups, I have no idea. He want to talk also about the idea of responsibility, of legal, there's no legal compulsion when it comes to private entities. Private corporations still need to abide to laws that are set to policemen, of negligence of a policeman. Whenever a policeman leaves an arm on the table, for example, when he goes to the canteen, you can still punish him even though he might be privatized necessarily. In fact, the contract can also be revoked. So the idea of accountability is still there anyway by side opposing opposition once you contend on that particular issue. But let's go to the second idea. How racial confidence will be better debated in American society. Because the real reason here is the element of racism after the one things that are happening in Ferguson. Why does this happen? Because when you connotate police as belonging to the state, whenever the police does something wrong, the people, the minority, connect that wrongdoing to the white majority dominated state necessarily. So the discourse now is white majority state is bullying the black minority necessarily. You pit them against each other. The discourse is racial. Mr. Speaker, the major problem in the US is not really racism, but the prejudicial biases that you have towards institutions to believe that they are white majority dominated, that they are out there to discriminate people. So even though it might not be a racial case, even though Darren Wilson might have legitimately shot Michael Brown, the discourse will still be racial in nature because you attach the police to the idea of a white dominated majority state necessarily. And whenever you kill a black or a Latino necessarily, you still attach that condition to the white policeman because it's connected to the state. That discourse is immediately radical and racial in nature. You push out any elements of neutrality or objectivity, it becomes negative in nature. People assume that it's a racial issue, but it might not be a racial issue. If you privatize companies, you'll be seen police corporations, you'll be seen as a separate entity, as a corporation, as a third party that is neutral. So there's no strings attached to the white dominant majority state necessarily. So the discourse will be more objective. People will see objectivity as what has this corporation, which is neutral in nature, has really done to this person? Have they really been doing something wrong, or are they racial profiling necessarily? The discourse becomes more objective and more fruitful in nature, are not the one that is happening in Ferguson today, where people automatically assume it's a racial issue. Before I move on, yes.
You seem to also not understand Brian's case, right? You disregard the fact that he said in his case that government will be the one funding the police force, right? So at the end of the day, your force is still affiliated with the government.
Yeah, merely funding doesn't mean that the state is will be directly criticized if the company is doing something wrong necessarily. The state funds a lot of things like your public transportation companies. But whenever a public transportation company screws up, you don't directly blame the state. You blame the public transportation company necessarily. There is some form of divide between what the state funds and what the state is directly accountable and criticized for. There is a distinction that needs to run. Let's look at the third and last idea of over-militarization. The problem today is that you have too much money is injected to the police force because of the scare tactics that are happening now. Well, you privatize, there will be no excessive spending because all corporations want to minimize the cost of their budget and minimize the cost of the police force. So you don't have big ammos and big tanks that you're seeing today that are threatening people, that are making people fearful, that are allowing aggressions to happen because of the large amount of scale or high-speed state weaponry that you have today. Of course, the police force, private police force will not also save too much to buy shoddy weapons. because you still need to be directly accountable to the contract, directly accountable to the law. So we strike a balance here, that they don't spend too much necessarily because they want to save money as a corporation, but they don't also spend too little because they are still accountable to the state and to the contract, allowing a police force that is proportionate to the crime that's happening in all particular areas of the United States. You decrease the over-militarization that you are seeing in Missouri today, and that is the objective that you are trying to achieve. For all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, side opening opposition talked about two things. Number one, on accountability, and also about government's control. What side closing op is going to do today is going to give you principal arguments on number one, what is it, how this devalues the nature of policemen, and number two, on the public power, engaging directly with the first substantive that we just talked about, right? Before going to my substantive, let's first rebut closing first, right? Because Waiget's problem, we did two substantive with this. The first thing was that public violence, police violence are somehow going to be associated with government's actions, right? We tell you that number one, I think it's safe enough to say that people of America are smart enough to divorce the two things and say, oh, it's not the government, it's the individual itself. But even if, let's assume Americans are that stupid, right? We tell you that even under their policy, right? These police are still, even if it's going to be privatized, they still have to be answerable to the state, right? Because the state is the one that is funding these people, right? So we tell you, even under their side, the state has got some involvement or a major chunk of involvement because they are the one who's funding these private police, right? So we tell you, even then, people will know, oh, it is these people, it is still the government who's associated with it. But irregardless, second, even if, right? We tell you that the laws that these private police follow are the laws that are made by the government, right? So people will still scrutinize government laws, right? And not just these private entities as a whole, right? We tell you, if they really want to solve racial tension, right? The main issue that came about Ferguson, right, is because the police force in US has got more white policemen compared to African American policemen. Right? That is a major issue, something they are not contending on their side. Tell you, the idea of racial tension does not fly on the side of government, right? Sit down. Secondly, on this idea of over-militarization, but his argument is this: police now buy so many tanks and so many big weapons, right? And they say do so because they don't want to spend much. Wait a minute. Under your side, the people who are funding this corporation is still the government. Why the hell would corporations care if they're going to use the government's money, which is the same thing that exists under status quo anyways, right? We don't see any difference there anyways, right? In fact, they want to spend more money on these machineries because it's not their money, it's government's money, right? We tell you it works better under our side, right? Sit down. Done with side closing. Let's tackle side opening government because side closing off does not discriminate accents, right? Let's first talk about let's talk about politicizing, the whole idea of politicizing, right? I think it is fair enough to say that it's very much difficult to divorce any political agenda from anything in this era in time, right? Even if it's not political leaders, it's going to be your CEOs of that said companies, right, Mr. Speaker, because they are the ones who are going to be controlled, right? Brian came up talking about how it's on a larger scale now, we somewhat outsource to other people and how it be based on a demand and whatnot. We tell you it is more dangerous under that. Why? Because now these private entities will choose where they want to send their policemen. Imagine there's two areas that have riots right now. They would rather send the policemen to areas which have got a bigger stakeholders under their company, right? I.e. people who are sponsoring or maybe their own people itself. But it's more detrimental under there when there is this form of biasness that exists in the corporation itself, right? Sit down, right? Even if these people are hired by a county, right? They are still answerable to your private companies because it is private companies that are somewhat outsourcing these people, right? Done with my rebuttals. No. Done with rebuttals. Let's go into my positive substance, right? Firstly, let's talk about public power because that's what we just substantive is, right? We tell you in Mr. Speaker, when police were to screw up, like I don't know, if you shoot a random black unarmed a teenager, right? He has to go to trial and all the court proceedings and justice is served, right? Yes, they can argue it will exist under their side as well. Why is it better under our side? Engaging directly what Vijay talked about. Right? We tell you number one, something our side has is public scrutiny, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because Brian said, oh, it's better if the individual has a better say. No, when your public has a better say, that is better for a public entity like the police force. Right? Why? Because if the policeman were to do something wrong, the public can scrutinize because government, Mr. Speaker, is answerable to its people. Your private companies is answerable to your big fat boss sitting with lots of cars in his pocket, right? We tell you it is better if these people are not. If it is privatized, right? We tell you more often than not, private and sweep these issues under the carpet. Why? Because they will be losing lots of money. They will get bad reputations. It is even worse if a private company gets bad reputation than the government getting bad reputation. Because these people are profit-based, Mr. Speaker. Something nobody in this house has talked about. I will extend it to my second substantive, right? But we tell you it is a lot better under our side when your policemen are answerable to the people, right? When answerable to the people. And how if anything goes on, the people can always scrutinize the government because they believe that is the way to go, right? Before I go on, I'll take closing.
In public and private, necessarily wrongdoings are intended to be covered up anyway. At least in the public sphere necessarily, when the problem is happening, essentially you allow prosecution to happen because you are not attracted to the idea that the state is a failure now. Engage with that.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen many times where the government is always accountable for its actions. Right? It's not like we have never seen any policeman being bound down or any policeman going to prison. Right? There's only this one case of Ferguson itself because there was not sufficient evidence. Right? That is why he got off the hook. Right? I think it's very much unfair to assume that there's never been in the history that a single public servant got arrested or a single public servant was acquitted for being a failure. Right? I think that is a mischaracterization coming from Richard. Right? Second, on how it devalues the nature of policemen. Mr. Speaker, you need to understand, when we talk about policemen, these people are heroes people, right? There are included people like firefighters and soldiers, right? The people that put their life on the line, right? It's like a noble profession. What happens when you privatize it? It makes it look like a profit-based job right now, Mr. Speaker. We tell you how for centuries policemen have been doing it not for the profit itself, not for the pay itself. It's because they want to serve their country, right, Mr. Speaker? Now when you privatize this, right, Mr. Speaker, it's going to create this perception from people, oh, this policeman does not really care of my safety, my protection. It is because of how the private entity works, right? It's not because it's doing it for the government, right? For the government to serve its people, right? It's a trickle-down effect and it's very much detrimental. Why? Because number one, they tell you people will lose trust in the government. It's based on the police, right? If Vijay was to talk about how their side gets more trust, right? We tell you as in status quo, it's already bad enough that the people don't trust police. It's going to get even worse when they know that your policemen are not answerable to the government, right? When they're not being controlled by the government, because the government has always been seen as someone who puts its people first, Mr. Speaker. I've told you two things. Number one, I've told you how it's better if public scrutiny exists when it comes to something like utilities, right? And secondly, I've told you how it devalues how policemen are perceived and makes it look like they're doing it not for the people. For all those reasons, I'm proud to propose.
It's a shame that side opposition comes out here and have the guts to tell us that the justice in America is working. When you recently have the indictment of Darren Wilson not being carried at all. In fact, you have no indictment of any white policeman arresting any for any misdoing towards the black community for the past 32 years in the United States of America. This shows you that it's actually time for change. It shows you that the current status quo is not working. But you cannot simply dismiss it just like how opposition bench dismiss. We will provide you better analysis and more in-depth analysis and contextualization of why exactly it has failed. This is how I'm going to do my week for each. I'll first deal with closing opposition, then opening opposition, then I'll talk about why a big chunk of what Regis has analyzed was essentially misanalyzed and that essentially caused the loss of side opposition, right? Let's look at what closing opposition wanted to talk about. Because they say the first thing that Bino decided to talk about is that Americans are smart enough to distinguish whether or not is it a racial profiling case or is it faith in the armed forces, right? We tell you no exactly. Because right now, when you already consider there is a form of white supremacy in this kind of county itself, the idea is this, that whatever crime that you do, whenever there is a person of a different race compared to the perpetrator arresting you, you will always be tied as, oh, the policeman has been racist. It can be very harmful in two instances. Number one, the victim may be really innocent and therefore he's subjected to the racial profiling and therefore killed for something that he or she has not done. But secondly, if the person did indeed carry out some things that are wrong, they will now be viewed as another victim of racism, right? I.e., there will be no incentive for them to change. In fact, people won't even recognize that he did something wrong. People will be saying that, oh, look, the police forces are being racist. These are the things that we have to solve because you have to recognize that the issue of police violence is very real. How do we protect it? We allow people to scrutinize the corporations, right? Because recognizing that these are now private entities, something that side opposition don't seem to understand, it means that even though the government is funding them, they are the ones responsible at the end. Because the obligation and the involvement of the government ends so far as to provide you the funds to do whatever you think is necessary to protect the justice of the society. That means whatever shifts that you have in your bureaucracy, whatever equipment or personnel that you employ are all under your own jurisdiction and accountability. That means if anything happens, the public will scrutinize the organization and the private company entity and not the government. Why is that good? Because from the very beginning, we've been saying that we're adopting a contract-based direct. That means, i.e., if you're not doing your job well, they will always be checked and that balances and we will always kick you out. There are always, the idea is this, right? When you privatize this form of police forces, there will be competition out there. There will be a lot of private firms who are ready to take over. There will be a lot of better people that you can get out there. So that's why it's better under our side, right? But secondly, they talk about how they allow public scrutiny because you cannot scrutinize the government. Seriously, guys, like you can scrutinize the government all you want, it's not changing a thing in status quo. Because right now you have the riots in Ferguson not doing anything. In fact, the grand jury is still saying that they did the right thing, right? This is obviously wrong and something that we're trying to force under our side because now you allow people to have true scrutiny. When you totally show the delineation between the government and the private institution, you allow justice to be happen because now people will perceive what's happening in status quo is that people perceive that any form of wrongdoing by the police forces is a wrongdoing by the state itself. Therefore, the grand jury more often than not has to err on the side of caution and go with popular decisions. Right? For example, like not carrying any action against them. This we will solve when we delineate ourselves and we allow the justice system to actually come into fruition when they know that now they will only be the private entities' fault and not a fault of the government, right? Something that they have to recognize. But secondly, they talk about the idea of a noble policeman on how we're devaluing it. Well, if it takes devaluing the idea of a policeman and it takes that to actually restore justice to the people and restore faith to the public about the policemen and the police forces, we are willing to do so, right? Because understand, at the end of the day, when you privatize it, it will be more efficient. You attract better talent because now you have better pay and you're more competitive, and training will be better under our side. So therefore, the efficiency is something that will be better under our side, right? But let's move on to opening opposition, right? It's a lot of funny things they want to talk about because firstly, they talk of the burden that they took onto themselves is better obligation into police forces without exactly telling us how exactly is it better, right? Because they seem to take the stance of demonizing the whole private entity without actually telling why it has failed. Because we tell you privatization has always outsourced to other companies because they recognize that number one, you'll be more efficient, right? How does it make more efficient? Because you allow people to you allow competition to happen when there are private institutions out there who are willing to fight for your contract, right? That means they're more often than not willing to comply with the rules. They're more often than not willing to do their job right and have more faith in society, something that they say police forces don't give a shit, to actually care more now because they know that if they don't do their job well, they will be kicked out. And these are not random police that we are picking, right? These are people who are going through proper trainings. The closest example you can provide are security guards, but way more efficient, right? The idea is this: when their firm is not doing their job or whenever they did something wrong, they can always be terminated, and that is why it's going to be more efficient, right? But the idea of them not being legally bound, we don't believe it's that case, because if they do something wrong, we can still try them under court, and there will be no favoritism shown, better under our side. But before I move on, sure.
Is the issue regarding police force in the US right now a problem with the justice system, or is it because it's owned by the government?
You have to understand that that problem is very much in tight, because right now the incentive for them to protect the police forces is in tight with the incentive for them at the long run. So therefore, the Attorney General and all these juries that you're talking about will more often than not want to side with the more popular side, which is the state, because they are worried that they will offend them, and they are worried that it will go against the idea that the states are not being in power now. But when they want to talk about state having direct management, why exactly is this good? Because now what they're doing is they can't even indict and prove whether or not Darren Wilson has really did something wrong. So when we allow them to be private, we allow this form of delineation, which allows for better investigation. And if in the case that the police personnel did screw up, it will be better under our side, because there will be no incentive for the police, for the law authorities to actually cover them out. Unlike these issues that the cameras have ran out of battery and all this shit, right? But let's move on to why our side is the most relevant to this debate. We provided you two things, right? Number one, proper links that ties with what is happening in status quo. But secondly, analyzing and contextualization of the real issue that's happening at hand, where we tell you that over-militarization is one of the problems, right? So we have really given you three essentials that are very much untackled and should be tackled by closing opposition. Number one, we show you how accountability will be better our side, under our side, when you show that there's a real divorce of the state government from these entities, and how they'll be more accountable now when they can be publicly scrutinized and actions can actually be taken against them. Secondly, we restore racial confidence in the people, because now we tell them that we are neutral forces. If we do screw up, you can always take action against us and you can vote us out. But third and most important idea is the idea of over-militarization, where police forces more often than not purchase unnecessary equipment such as tanks to use as a scare tactic. Under the private institution, they won't do that, because number one, they're still a profit-making organization, and they want to secure this sort of profits to actually give it and train better people at the end of the day. With that, we're very proud to post.
The debate at night is like always.
Mr. Speaker, Vinod's POI was very important, right? When he asked the problem with side government, whether or not it's with the justice system or really is it with the police force, right, Mr. Speaker? Because we tell you that their solution to this problem is merely an overreaction and just causes more harm, right, Mr. Speaker? Now, before this is how I'm going to do my speech. I'm going to do it issue by issue, right? I'm going to solve you three issues in this debate. First of all, whether or not there really is a problem contended by side government, and then second of all, I'm going to talk to you about two issues. So, which side actually provides a better police force, right, Mr. Speaker? Because that's something that we all want to see. Which side actually proves this better? Now, but before we move on to these issues, let's look at the case proposed by side opening government, because this is what Brian wanted to talk to you about. That somehow, just because you give the administration, for instance, to another company for them to deal with, but at the same time having it funded by government, we as side closing opposition really don't see a privatization in that case, right? We tell you that what side government should have done was just bite the bullet, which is quite ironic because we're talking about police. Sorry, but we tell you that they should have just bitten the bullet and say that, well, they should actually, this police force should actually find their own funding, for instance, and be totally private, right, Mr. Speaker? Because what has their case caused them? What it has done is that it has caused this whole entire affiliation with the government. Thus closing government's point about all this separation from government image will still exist, right, Mr. Speaker? Because people still know that this police force is actually being funded by the government. Now, let's move on to my issues, right? Well, first of all, whether or not there is really a problem, sit down. Because this is the problem contended by side opening government, is this, that, well, the AG is chosen by the government itself. I don't see why that's a problem, right, Mr. Speaker? Because under their case, well, they now want the police force to choose it. But we tell you this, democracy is limited, right? People don't really have a say in everything. For instance, people don't have a say in what the government spends into. It's thus proving that people actually do have a limitation in what they have to say to their government, and that is why you elect representatives. For instance, that is the whole reason why you have elections. Anyway, now even if you say that this isn't enough, you now have to increase the check and balances that exist. We tell you it's an overreaction when you want to privatize the whole entire police force, where you can just actually increase the law, right, Mr. Speaker, create check and balances that can actually prevent this AG from causing more problems. Sit down. Now, the second problem is this, that, well, there's a lack of prosecution coming from the AG. But, well, if that's your problem, then change your AG. If you find him problematic, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to privatize your whole entire police force in the end of the day, right, Mr. Speaker? So we tell you that that's why their case is a problem-solution mismatch on their side. Hold on. Now, the third problem that came from site closing government was this. Well, the current police force is actually militarizing their force, right, by buying drones and putting them on the streets, thus creating this fear. But we tell you, the wages contention was this, that somehow once you privatize the military force, they will actually spend their money on better things, not such as drones, but on good weapons. But we tell you that's an assumption, right? Because that can actually still happen even though the police force is privatized. That they can actually still buy drones, for instance, and whatnot. Now, because people do not control the budget and purchases of the police force anyway under the case, right, Mr. Speaker? Now, but even if they want to over-militarize the police, we tell you that's fine because it's for the protection of the people in the end of the day. Sit down. Oh no, wait, before I move on to my second issue, yes, go.
Essentially, when the state funds to police force, they won't buy drones because they will channel the money to the salaries of policemen and CEO. Just because you receive a lot of money doesn't mean you must spend a lot of money.
I really don't understand your problem with the budget, right? Is it because they're overspending, or what are they spending it towards, too, right? Because if your plan is overspending, then government can just limit the budget that is given to the police anyway, right? Now, sit down. Now, another problem that state government has is that, well, people have less say in the police force. But like I told you, democracy is limited, and besides, and even if the police force is privatized, what makes you think that this private force will actually listen to the people? What incentive do they have when they're actually being funded by the government? What incentive do they have to listen to the people? But let's look at the second issue, right, Mr. Speaker? Which side actually provides a better police force? Because let's look at the first issue, first level, accountability. Well, this is what was contended by side government. Well, first of all, Patrick wanted to say that, well, the government is always siding with the police, right? Because, well, police is under the government. But we tell you that's wrong, right? Because if that was your contention, then why do you see police being prosecuted for bribery, for instance? If that was the case, then no police would be discharged, no police would be fired under their force, right? It would be some total immunity that the police have. So we tell you that government doesn't really always side with the police. But second of all, that we wanted to say that, well, state has failed the police, so this is why the government has to run away from this bad image. That action already proves to you that the government is actually really failing the people, right? You don't want to cement that kind of idea into the mind of the people, thus making them distrust the police even more. We tell you that's an act of cowardice, and you shouldn't do that in the first place. You should actually improve your police force and not privatize it. But the second issue under is this, because side opening government had a problem with the police force being affiliated by the government. But we told you, by funding, it actually shows affiliation, right? Now, but then third of all, let's talk about racial confidence, something that we don't want to talk to you about also. They said that the force, just because the force is separated from the government, people won't affiliated with racists, right? But we tell you that the police that they are going to hire also have racists, right? For instance, there can actually be that sense of racial confidence, a problem of racial confidence in their side. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is efficiency. Well, Patrick contended that the police will be now more efficient because they will get higher pay. But we tell you that's an assumption, right? Because in the end of the day, the government will be controlling the money that is being given to the police force. What has talked to you about, right? He talked to you about how your policy actually devalues the nature of the police force, right? Something that was never rebutted by side closing government. So we tell you that because you privatize it, you actually devalue the effort of the police, for instance, or the job of the policeman in the end of the day. But second of all, he also talked about public power, for instance, something that clashed directly with Wei-Jia's points. Now, because of these two contentions coming from side closing opposition, we tell you to take this debate.
Thank you everyone for this debate. I'll try to go and go to all. Maybe at the